The fourth theme I'm reading about is one called Deep Specialization Creates Deep Value. And it's an article, I think it's Financial Times again, which looks at inside the font factory, the man who shapes the world's letters. A font factory is basically a design studio that designs the style of the letters you see published in, well, everywhere, whether it's a website, whether it's an airport, and so on. And I must tell you something, that we don't take fonts seriously. When you read any publication or you travel anywhere, you don't worry about the font, right? But it's very clear that depending on how the font is created, it creates a certain atmosphere that impacts you. I went to Finland once, Helsinki, and I haven't been to Finland ever. I don't think I've ever been to Finland, my first trip. And I never left the airport. I was quite astonished at how well designed that airport was, but particularly the fonts in the airport. You know those fonts overhead, when you're walking in an airport, you see all the signage and language. And I was shocked at how clean the font was, but I was also shocked at how well integrated the font design, which is very Spartan, very simple, but yet warm, how well integrated it is with the overall layout of the airport. It's as if someone designed the font and then designed the airport around the font, or someone designed the airport and then built the font around the airport. But there's symmetry, there's cleanliness, it's just beautiful. And after seeing that, I fell in love with that font, and I've decided to use that kind of thinking in everything we're doing. That's the impact of fonts. Now, why am I talking about fonts? The reason I'm talking about this article is because here was a man who, you can imagine what his career discussion was like, right? He was designing fonts. Can you imagine how many people told him there's no future in this? No one even knows what a font lab is, or a foundry as they call it. They call it a foundry because historically, before electronic design of fonts occurred on MacBooks, fonts were designed in large pressing labs whereby they design a font on stencils in steel and then build it into a press whereby it physically pressed the font onto paper. So it was very hard to build a font. If you had to design a font, you had to design it with a ruler and pencil, and then you had to test it by carving out these steel plates. It took forever. So it was so hard, it wasn't easy to iterate these things. So there's no real career here. And you can imagine this guy who built the world's most famous font foundry. Today, digital agencies that design in MacBooks and so on, we call them foundries as a nod to their heritage. But his career discussion was, there's no future, so why don't you expand into designing posters? Why don't you expand into designing movie posters or designing pamphlets or birthday cards and so on? But he chose to specialize. When large foundries moved to the Mac, he stayed in fonts. When print moved to digital, he stayed in fonts. Now when we move from the Western version of how we deliver fonts to the Asian version, which is very different, he stayed in fonts, and he's staying in fonts. But in the process of staying in one thing and finding ways to do it better and better, he has specialized in the middle of the T. You know the T model? The T model says you can either have a breadth of skills, which is the top horizontal part, or you can focus in one area, which is the middle. The reality is that people who do great things specialize in something. Even a generalist is specializing in something. They just have the other skills to buffer them around. But the truly amazing things we see in the world today is done by someone who specializes in one or two things, but usually one thing. Even someone who launches two businesses, it's a specialization in one thing they can carry across to multiple businesses. So the question is, why will you not specialize, and what will you specialize in? And how does a company specialize while diversifying and managing the resistance from employees who believe that you should be doing multiple unrelated things? There's always going to be an example of a company that does unrelated things that's doing well until it doesn't do well. There's going to be an example of a company that specializes and does well until it doesn't do well. But there are more examples of companies that have deeply specialized, stayed in business for a long time, created enormous value, than companies that have been diversified conglomerates and stay that way forever. You need to think about how to specialize. If you look at the pandemic planning work we have, and that's available to Slides members, the way we go about analyzing how a company can respond to a disaster, pandemic, epidemic doesn't happen overnight. It comes from deep specialization of risk in strategy. If we just looked at the best practices in risk, we'd come up with something fairly average. But no, we said, okay, over many, many years, we've been thinking about risk in strategy. How do you manage risk? How do you measure risk? What is risk? Is there such a thing as a good risk versus a bad risk? Is there such a thing as a core risk versus a non-core risk? What about critical risk versus a non-critical risk? Which risks should be kept on your balance sheet? Which should be kept off your balance sheet? That comes from specialization. And of course, when you specialize, you give up certain things, but at the same time, you do one thing well, which means you'll be paid higher, versus trying to do many things and being paid a lot less. You still make a lot of money, but your return is a little bit lower. So as you go into the new year, I picked these articles because they give you a lot to think about. Every decision you make today is a decision that you will see the results of in 1, 2, 3, 4 years' time. Those 4 years are going to happen. You cannot stop the clock. This is not a basketball game. Whether you are ready, whether you are not ready, whether you want to take a off-ramp and have children or get married or take time away, the world moves on. The people you compete with become better. They don't stop as well. Some of them will take a time out. They do think it's a basketball game. So ask yourself, what do you want to be good at? You can't be good at everything, right? You pick some things, you go in that direction. And then look at your last year. I mean, we all start off well. We think a year is not a long time. It's actually a long time. Look at your last year and say, what did I do? What worked? What didn't work? Was I more productive? Was I more productive last year versus the year before? Productivity being output value. All the increase in your asset values, home and so on, increase in your income, increase in your intangible assets, which are things you've learned, divided by your total input cost, which is the cost to do it, and the time you spend to do it. I mean, did you actually get better? And the trend should always be positive. And if it's not positive, you've got to relook at certain things. But it's a process. You'll make a lot of mistakes, you'll get better. As long as you're getting better, it doesn't matter if you make mistakes. But deep specialization has always been the way capitalism has worked. Companies that specialize in something solve a problem better than someone else. They make money. Then they get short-sighted and they think we can't do it any better. So let's take that money and invest in some diversified venture, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work, and they destroy capital. And as always, as you know, we have many books out. We have the Strategy Journal, we have Mavis, we have Succeeding as a Management Consultant. Firms Consulting is running a special. If you buy the book and post a review on Goodreads, and if you have time and would like to do so, post one on Amazon as well, and you submit a copy of your receipt to support@firmsconsulting.com, and there is a deadline, so you should do this sooner rather than later, and you should write to support to find out the deadline. We will give you a complimentary 1-month access to the accompanying video programs that go into the concepts in the book in a lot more detail. Write to support to understand all of the criteria. But as always, I hope you're enjoying this podcast series, and we will see you next week, Monday at 8 a.m. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.